Hello, class. Today we are going to read Chapter 9, pages 170 to 175. So here we go.
Even as the Civil War was splitting the nation in two, another struggle was threatening the lives and futures of many Minnesotans. This one pitted some of Minnesota's oldest residents, the Dakota, against its newest residents, the European and American settlers. By the early 1860s, the Dakota's traditional homelands were rapidly filling up with farms and towns. The 1851 treaties of Traverse de Sioux and Mendota had left the Dakota with a narrow strip of land along the Minnesota River. In 1858, Dakota leaders were taken to Washington, D.C., and kept there until they signed a treaty turning over the northern half of their reservation. All that remained of the original Dakota homeland was an even narrower strip, now just 10 miles wide. In just one decade, the Dakota's surroundings had changed so quickly that living life as they knew it was no longer possible. As former Dakota hunting grounds filled with settlers, some European Americans tried to convince the Dakota to adopt new ways of life. Food supplies were short, and many Dakota were hungry. The treaties had promised annual payments or annuities to help them buy the things they needed. The annuities were often late, increasing tensions. All that was needed was a spark for disaster to strike. In the summer of 1862, the spark came. It ignited one of the bloodiest episodes in Minnesota's history. Naming a war. Many names have been given to this war over the years. Some include Sioux Massacre, Sioux Uprising, Little Crow's Uprising, and Minnesota Indian War of 1862. These names seem to overemphasize Little Crow's role, downplay the significance of the war, or imply the Dakota were fighting for no reason. Northern Lights uses U.S. Dakota War of 1862 because this name shows it was a war between two sovereign nations. Dakota land cessions and reservations in Minnesota. Treaties dramatically reduced Dakota lands. How much land did the Dakota occupy before 1851? Compare that to the amount after the Treaty of 1858.
So here's the land ceded before 1851. Here's the land in orange that was ceded in 1851, 1858, 1863. Other land, this was the Ojibwe, mostly. And then the total amount.
Setting the stage at the Lower Sioux Agency. The Dakota's reservation along the Minnesota River was split into two areas, each with its own government field office or agency. The Upper Sioux Agency was close to the confluence or meeting of the Yellow Medicine River and the Minnesota River. The Lower Sioux Agency was near the confluence of the Minnesota and Redwood Rivers. The U.S. government used Sioux rather than Dakota in their agency names. By 1862, both agencies had grown into small towns. The town at the Lower Sioux Agency was an especially busy place, with homes, mills, warehouses, stores, a stable, a steamboat landing, and a schoolhouse. European American traders and government workers filled the town at the Lower Sioux Agency. The Dakota lived on the surrounding reservation land. The culture and perspectives of these two groups were very different. These differences led to a tragic conflict. Traditional Dakota. In the summer of 1862, many Dakota at the Lower Agency lived in villages with teepees and bark lodges along the south side of the Minnesota River. Each village was led by a respected leader, such as Little Crow 5 or Ta Oyate Duta, Blue Earth or Makato, and Red Banner or Wapahasha. Families in these villages wanted to continue their traditional ways of life. They were traditional Dakota. They kept their sacred rituals and beliefs, even though the missionaries tried to convert them to Christianity. Men and women often traveled off the reservations to hunt game and gather food. Farm Dakota. By 1862, several hundred Dakota on the reservation were living on farms away from the traditional villages. These farm Dakota grew crops, raised livestock, and lived in wood or brick houses along the main road that cut through the reservation. Most of them, including the Dakota leader Wounded Man, or Taopi, abandoned some traditional Dakota customs and adapted to the European American way of life. The farm Dakota wore American-style clothing, and many attended the missionaries' churches. The Dakota were pressured to look as much like European Americans as possible. Men were to cut their hair short, and women were to wear theirs pinned up on their heads. So what? Adapting to change. During the 1850s, Minnesota experienced a dramatic population shift. In just 10 years, the region went from being inhabited mostly by American Indians to mostly European Americans. The Dakota had to choose how to respond to the changes going on around them. Traditional Dakota tried to maintain the lifestyle they had known for generations. Farm Dakota saw advantages to the settlers' way of life, and some believed in Christianity. Most Dakota fit somewhere in between those two lifestyles, keeping some of the old ways while also adopting some new ways. As they became increasingly outnumbered, many Dakota decided it would be wise to show outward signs of fitting in with their new neighbors. By making some changes in appearance, these Dakota believed the newcomers would not feel as threatened by them and would leave them alone. In addition, some people had both Dakota relatives and European American ones. For them, choosing one side over the other was even harder. Can you think of a time when you encountered something unfamiliar and had to choose, reject it, adapt to it, or find some sort of compromise? Government workers. In 1862, the top government official at both the Upper and Lower Sioux agencies was the Indian agent Thomas Galbraith. He was the person responsible for carrying out the U.S. government's assimilation policies on the reservations. These policies were designed to make the Dakota change their traditional lifestyle and adopt European American practices. Many believed the Dakota needed to assimilate in order to survive. The agent oversaw a number of government workers, including blacksmiths, carpenters, and a doctor. Many of these people lived and worked in buildings surrounding each agency's headquarters. The agent also handed out the food and money that the U.S. government had promised the Dakota under the treaties of 1851 and 1858. In their own words, Thomas Galbraith. Indian agent Thomas Galbraith expressed his views in 1861 about the Dakota.
The beliefs and habits of the Indian must be eradicated. Habits of industry and economy must be introduced in the place of idleness. The peaceful pursuit of home life must be substituted for the warpath, the chase, and the dance. And more than all, the hostility of the Indian opposed to this policy must be met on the threshold.
Traders. The government allowed a small group of traders, including one named Andrew Myrick, to run stores where the Dakota could buy additional food and supplies. The traders usually worked on a credit system similar to the one used during the fur trade decades earlier. Traders provided goods to the Dakota and expected them to pay their debts when they received their annuities. The traders kept written records of every business deal they made. The Dakota did not. Some Dakota indicated they did not trust all of the traders. This added to tension on the reservation. Missionaries. A few settlers in the area were missionaries. Their main goal was to convince the Dakota to give up their spiritual traditions and accept Christianity. Missionaries lived among the Dakota. Many learned their language. They got to know many Dakota well and often spoke up for them during disputes with the traders and the Indian agent. By 1862, two missionaries, Samuel Hinman and John Williamson, had founded churches near the Lower Sioux Agency. They believed the only way for the Dakota to survive was to adapt to their new situation. The U.S. government's policies toward the Dakota supported this goal. In their own words, Andrew Myrick. Andrew Myrick was a trader who kept two stores, one at the Upper and one at the Lower Sioux Agency. Several historical accounts suggest that Myrick and other traders enraged the Dakota when they dismissed their appeals for food in August 1862. It is likely the traders were worried they would not be paid for their goods. According to one version of the story told decades later, Myrick said,
"So far as I'm concerned, if they're hungry, let them eat grass."
Tensions rise. As government officials and missionaries worked to change Dakota culture, tensions increased. The whites were always trying to make the Indians give up their life and live like white men, recalled the traditional Dakota leader Big Eagle, or Wambdi Tanka. The Indians wanted to live as they did before. If the Indians had tried to make the whites live like them, the whites would have resisted, and it was the same way with many Indians. As more and more Dakota accepted European American ways, tensions rose among the Dakota themselves. Many traditional Dakota were angry because the government gave extra food, tools, and livestock to the farm Dakota. More importantly, traditional Dakota often blamed farm Dakota for abandoning their heritage. For their part, farm Dakota had reasons for their actions too. Some truly believed in the changes they were making. Others thought adopting new ways would keep them safe. Both traditional Dakota and farm Dakota made decisions based on what they thought was best for their future. However, deep resentments developed that would last for years to come.
All right, class, that concludes pages 170 to 175. Please complete the textbook questions for those same pages and submit them either through Kami or print the PDF or write your answers on your own piece of paper. Have a great day. We will talk to you later. Bye.